She fell to her knees in the middle of the marble hallway, tears streaking her face as her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Don't trust anyone here." The janitor was the last person she expected to see standing there, calm, silent, holding the one thing that could save her mother's life. Everyone else had turned away. But why was he watching her like that? With eyes that seemed to know her pain too well. What she was about to learn would shatter everything she thought she knew about her family and about him.
Every morning before the city woke, Daniel unlocked the gleaming glass doors of the corporate tower and began his quiet ritual. His mop glided across the marble floors, his reflection following him like a ghost, a reminder of how easily he disappeared in places like this. To most, he was just the janitor. No one ever looked long enough to see the tired strength in his hands or the quiet pride in his work. And upstairs, in the same building, Grace Langford, daughter of the company's powerful CEO, lived a world away. Her days were filled with luxury, polite smiles, and the constant weight of her father's expectations. She'd seen Daniel before, of course, but never really noticed him. Few ever did. NNTHAT morning, though, the air in the building felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. Grace's phone buzzed with a call that drained the color from her face. Her mother had collapsed. The hospital needed her there immediately, but her father was unreachable, locked in a high-stakes meeting that couldn't be disturbed. As she stumbled through the corridors, searching for someone, anyone, to help, she saw Daniel standing by the service elevator, his uniform neat, his eyes steady. For a moment, their worlds collided, privilege and invisibility meeting in silence. NNSHE didn't know it yet, but Daniel carried something far heavier than a mop that day. A truth buried deep in the company's past, one that tied him to her family in ways she could never imagine. And before the day was over, that truth would demand to be seen. The elevator doors slid shut behind them with a hollow clang. Grace's hands trembled as she pressed the button again and again, but nothing happened. Daniel stood quietly beside her, his calm presence only deepening her unease. The emergency lights flickered across his face. Not with fear, but with something else. Resolve NN. When the elevator finally lurched back to life, Daniel spoke softly, telling her which hospital to go to, what to say, who to ask for. His tone was steady, almost rehearsed, as if he had known this moment would come. She didn't question it. Not yet. She just needed to save her mother. At the hospital, the chaos swallowed her. Nurses rushed by, machines beeped, voices blurred into a single hum of panic. Grace watched as the doctors wheeled her mother away, feeling helpless. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw Daniel again. He wasn't supposed to be there. Yet he moved through the corridors like he belonged, as if this was a place he'd known for years. NSHE followed him, confusion growing with every step. He stopped at the end of a long, sterile hallway, staring at a photo on the wall, an old image of the hospital's founding donors. Grace froze. Her father's face was there, but so was another man, standing beside him, smiling. A man who looked exactly like Daniel. NHER breath caught. The resemblance was undeniable. Daniel noticed her reflection in the glass, but didn't turn around. He whispered something she barely caught. A name. It was her mother's maiden name, and memories began to twist in her mind, small things she'd ignored. The way her mother's voice softened whenever Daniel's name came up in staff conversations. The quiet donations to community programs her father never discussed. And that warning her mother had given her, "Don't trust anyone here." When she finally confronted Daniel, her voice was shaking. But before she could speak, 2 security guards approached. They didn't ask questions. They didn't care that she was the CEO's daughter. They only saw a black man in a restricted area. Their hands were already on him before she could explain. Daniel didn't resist. He simply looked at her, not with anger, but with sorrow. The same sorrow she had seen in her mother's eyes the night before. And as they dragged him toward the exit, he said one sentence that froze her completely. "Your mother, she was my sister." NTHE words hit like a storm, tearing through everything she thought she knew. She tried to speak, to stop the guards, but they were already gone, and Daniel with them. And outside, the sun was setting behind the hospital, painting the sky with red and gold. Grace stood frozen, her mind unraveling. How could her father have hidden something like this? Why had her mother kept it secret? And most of all, what had Daniel meant when he said, "She was my sister"? NNTHE, truth was closer than she could imagine. And before the night ended, it would destroy everything her family had built,
The news spread through the building before the morning sun could rise. The janitor had been arrested. Grace's father stormed through the hospital halls, his face red with anger, his voice echoing off the cold walls. To everyone else, it looked like a CEO defending his company's image. But to Grace, it looked like guilt. Her mother was still unconscious, her heartbeat fragile on the monitor beside her bed. Grace stood at her side, Daniel's last words looping in her mind. She was my sister. It sounded impossible. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more the pieces began to align. Ignoring the security guards, protests, she went to the lower wing of the hospital where Daniel had been taken. Through the narrow glass of the holding room, she saw him sitting silently, his wrists cuffed, his eyes fixed on the floor. There was no anger in them, only exhaustion and truth. When their eyes met, time seemed to stop. In that moment, she saw something her father had spent years hiding. Not shame, but connection. Daniel had her mother's eyes, and Grace demanded answers. But before she could reach him, her father appeared, shouting for her to leave. His voice broke, not with authority but with fear, and as the guards turned to remove Daniel, he finally spoke. NHI's words cut through the sterile air like thunder. He told the truth. How decades ago he had fallen in love with Grace's mother when they were both young. How her wealthy family had forced her to choose reputation or love. How she'd walked away, hiding her pain while her brother Daniel disappeared into a life of silence and struggle. Grace's father had built an empire on that silence. Promotions, awards, power, all resting on a buried secret. Now, standing before them both, Grace saw the empire begin to crack. Every lie, every polished speech, every photo in the hallway suddenly felt like a grave marker for something lost long ago. Daniel's voice softened, almost a whisper. I never wanted revenge, only truth. And with that, Grace realized the real injustice wasn't just in the color of his skin, but in how easily her world had chosen to forget him.
The next morning, the news broke before the board meeting could begin. Someone had leaked the truth. Old photographs, family records, documents buried under years of silence. The headlines were ruthless. The city that once praised the Langford name now whispered about betrayal, shame, and the secret that had been hidden beneath luxury. Grace watched her father face the cameras, his confident posture gone, replaced by a man who could no longer run from what he'd done. Her mother, still recovering, refused to look at him. But Daniel didn't show up to accuse or destroy. He showed up to forgive. NNHE stood before the same crowd that once ignored him, his janitor's uniform traded for a simple suit. The world expected anger, but all he offered was truth. He spoke about the cost of silence, the years of invisibility, the small daily humiliations that no headline could ever capture. His voice didn't rise. It resonated. Grace stood in the crowd, tears burning her eyes. For the first time, she saw the world through his pain and through her own family's deception. She realized that racism doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers in boardrooms, in closed doors, in the quiet decision to look away. When Daniel finished speaking, the room was silent. Not out of respect, but out of shame. Grace knew that apology alone would never be enough, but truth had to start somewhere. Weeks later, Daniel left the city. No fanfare, no attention, just peace. He'd carried his story for too long. Now it belonged to everyone who had ever been unseen. And Grace took his words to heart. She dismantled her father's company from within, transforming it into something that finally honored the people who built it. And as she stood once more in that marble hallway, the same place where her world had shattered, she whispered the truth Daniel had taught her. And some secrets don't destroy families, silence does. Because in a world built on denial, maybe the bravest thing you can do is finally see.